If a professional athlete paid millions of dollars a year can be misvalued, who can't be? If the supposedly pure meritocracy of professional sports can't distinguish between lucky and good, who can? The Moneyball story has practical implications, but to me it has a broader and less practical message. Don't be deceived by life's outcomes. At that moment, I was sure really of only one thing. I was of no possible economic value to the outside world. I had majored in art history, for a start. Even then, majoring in art history was regarded as an act of insanity. I was almost certainly less well prepared than you are for the marketplace. Yet somehow, I've wound up rich and famous. Sort of. I'm going to explain briefly how that happened, and because I want you to understand just how mysterious careers can be before you go out and have one for yourself. But at Princeton, studying art history, I felt really the first twinge of literary ambition. It happened while I was working on my senior thesis. I wrote at nights without much effect, mainly because I hadn't the first clue what I should write about. One night, I was invited to a dinner where I sat next to the wife of a big shot of a big Wall Street investment bank, Salomon Brothers. She more or less forced her husband to give me a job. I knew next to nothing about Salomon Brothers, but Salomon Brothers happened to be where Wall Street was being reinvented into the Wall Street we've come to know and love today. When I got there, I was assigned almost arbitrarily to the very best job in the place to observe the growing madness. They turned me into the house derivatives expert. A year and a half later, Salomon Brothers was handing me a check for hundreds of thousands of dollars to give advice about derivatives to professional investors. Now I had something to write about: Salomon Brothers. Wall Street had become so unhinged that it was paying recent Princeton graduates who knew nothing about money small fortunes to pretend they were experts about money. I'd stumbled into my next senior thesis. At that point, I called up my father, and I told him I was going to quit this job that promised me millions of dollars to write a book for an advance of 40 grand. There was this long pause on the other end of the line. "You might just want to think about that one," he said. "Why?" I asked. "You could stay at Salomon Brothers for 10 years, you could make your fortune, and then you could write your books," he said. But I didn't need to think about it. I knew what intellectual passion felt like because I'd felt it here at Princeton, and I wanted to feel it again. I was 26 years old. Had I waited until I was 36, I would never have done it. I'd have forgotten the feeling, and it would have felt too risky. The book I wrote was called Liar's Poker. It sold 1 million copies. I was 28 years old. I had a career, a little fame, a small fortune, and a new life narrative. All of a sudden, people were telling me I was a born writer. This was absurd. Even I could see that there was another, more true narrative, with luck as its theme. What were the odds of being seated at that dinner next to the Salomon Brothers lady, of landing inside the best Wall Street firm to write the story of the age, of landing in the seat with the best view of the business, of having parents who didn't disinherit me, but instead sighed and said, "Do it if you must," of having had that sense of must kindled inside of me by a professor of art history at Princeton, of having been let into Princeton in the first place. So this isn't just false humility, it's false humility with a point. My case illustrates how success is always rationalized. People really don't like to hear success explained away as luck, especially successful people. As they age and succeed, people feel their success was somehow inevitable. They don't want to acknowledge the role played by accident in their lives. There's a reason for this. The world doesn't want to acknowledge it either. I actually wrote a book about this called Moneyball. It was ostensibly about baseball, but it was in fact about something else. There are poor teams and rich teams in professional baseball, and they spend radically different sums of money on their players. When I wrote my book, the richest team, the New York Yankees, was was then spending about $120 million on its 25 players. The poorest team was the Oakland A's, and they were spending about $30 million. And yet the Oakland team was winning more games, or as many games as the New York Yankees, and more games than every other team, all of whom were richer than they were. This isn't supposed to happen. In theory, the rich teams should buy the best players and win all the time. But the Oakland team had figured something out that no one else had figured out. The rich teams didn't really understand who the best baseball players were. The players were misvalued. And the biggest single reason they were misvalued was that the experts did not pay sufficient attention to the role of luck in baseball success. Players got given credit for things that depended on the performance of others. Pitchers got paid for winning games. Hitters got paid for knocking in runners on base. Players got blamed and credited for events totally beyond their control, where balls that got hit happened to land in the field, for example. So forget baseball, forget this is even sports. Here you have these corporate employees being paid millions of dollars a year. They're doing exactly the same job that people in their business have done for more than a century, in front of millions of people, each of whom think they're an expert on what a good baseball player is. They had statistics attached to every move they made on the job, and yet they were misvalued because the wider world was blind to their luck. So I think you have to ask, if a professional athlete paid millions of dollars a year can be misvalued, who can't be? If the supposedly pure meritocracy of professional sports can't distinguish between lucky and good, who can? The Moneyball story has practical implications. If you use better data, you can find better values, and there are always market inefficiencies to exploit and so on. But to me, it has a broader and less practical message. Don't be deceived by life's outcomes. Life's outcomes, while not entirely random, have a huge amount of luck baked into them. Above all, recognize that if you had success, you've also had luck. And with luck comes obligation. You owe a debt, and not just to your gods. You owe a debt to the unlucky. So never forget, don't be deceived by life's outcomes.